Hi, everyone. Really excited and honored that I get to give the keynote today. I want to make sure the Q&A is kind of informal. So once we get to that part, feel free to throw questions out. I'll call on folks. But just because I'm up here talking doesn't mean it's super formal. As I kind of was trying to think about what I wanted to speak about today, and based on sort of the title, sustainability in the private sector and how policy fits into that, I really try to think back about kind of where I've come from in my career over the past 12 years, how that relates to my econ and foreign affairs major, and how you all might be able to apply that and what you're thinking about career-wise. So there are three key areas I want to talk about today. One is drive. So for me, that's been a constant in my career. Passion for what I do is what fuels me, but drive is what got me to many of the kind of next steps in my career. The second thing is perspectives, and this will make more sense when I talk about it, but I've had the opportunity to work for trade organizations that represent many companies, but also obviously at Tesla, I represent one company's interests. And so my role in many ways has become sort of a sales role and understanding different perspectives, even though I'm driving policy that sometimes have an impact as a greater good, but sometimes really benefit my company. So perspective is the second part. And then the third part is really impact. And I think that's where I kind of want to take a step back and talk about how looking at sustainability as a career path, you can really have an impact. But then again, how that relates to sort of what we're doing in the private sector and the role that private companies can have in sort of driving towards a greater good. So three areas. First one on the drive side, what do I mean by that? And I think in order to understand that, you kind of have to understand where my career has gone. So I was really drawn back at UVA to being an econ major because I was interested in markets. And I also really wanted to understand how regulation impacted those markets. And so early on at UVA, I decided I wanted to be a foreign affairs major. And then sort of later on, I decided that actually I should also be an econ major because I can marry sort of those two areas. What didn't happen initially is that I didn't think about sustainability or clean energy or the environment at all, really. In my first couple of years at UVA, I was more driven by sort of the market side, the regulatory side. And then my third year, I took an environmental economics course and I started taking more sustainable policy classes. And I started getting really interested. Something really started to kind of click for me in the space, thinking about how I could have sort of an impact towards clean energy, transportation electrification, all these big topics. But then also maintain some of those kind of underlying principles. So long story short, when I graduated from UVA, I pretty much knew I wanted to go into the policy sector, but I also knew I wanted to work on sustainability. And coming out in 2010, that wasn't actually the easiest thing to do. I think we were still experiencing sort of the tail end of some of the economic impacts of 2008 and things like that. And so as I was exploring what to do, I ended up actually just taking an internship at a very small sustainability consulting firm in Boulder, Colorado. And I worked on a couple of really interesting small projects. One was, a life cycle sustainability assessment for a bigger company and their product. I got to kind of see the whole gamut of what sustainability could be all about. And I decided ultimately that was interesting, but I really wanted to do policy. So I went to DC and I got another internship. I worked at a trade association representing a lot of different smaller companies in the energy space. And I got to eventually turn that into a full-time position and sort of really learn what it was like to work on Capitol Hill at the federal level. And I decided that's too slow for me. I don't like the politics of it. I don't like the negotiation and the back and forth for many years. You can work on a bill for 8 years and it never becomes law, that type of thing. So I moved to California and started working for a trade organization that represented many of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley, but I worked specifically on energy and environment. And so it was really interesting perspective to just kind of understand all these companies' interests, why they had joined this trade organization, why they wanted us to be working on energy and environmental issues for them. Why does, back then, why did Google care about water conservation, right? So I got a really interesting view of what those companies cared about, but I had to represent their kind of united interests. And one of those companies happened to be Solarcity at the time, which is a rooftop solar company. And so I had the opportunity to join the policy team there. And so that's when I made the switch into kind of the private sector. And then I was part of the acquisition of Solarcity to Tesla. Really interesting to be part of an acquisition of a company. And I learned a lot, especially on the policy team. So I've been with Tesla about 7 years, if you count my time at Solarcity. So in 2017, I started working on exclusively policy that relates to the infrastructure to charge electric vehicles. So my day-to-day really focuses on making sure we have a viable product, we're able to support our customers, and regulation impacts that can impact our products really allows us to move the market forward. But I'll talk a bit later about other stuff I work on that you wouldn't expect based on the interests of Tesla. And I think going back to sort of how does this all relate to drive? For me, my passion towards making impact in sustainable energy, which is what Tesla's mission is, right? Our mission is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy, is really what fueled me throughout my career. Each of these different groups I worked for, that's sort of the theme, but my drive, it's what's enabled me to really move forward in each of these positions and roles. And so passion is a really important key to whatever career you look for, but you also need to have the drive and put in the hard work to kind of make an impact. And so I think as an econ major, you have so many opportunities and doors that will open for you. And there are just many different pathways you can go down, but drive is sort of something that I think will really allow you to not only see those opportunities, but also take them. So the second part that I wanted to touch on is different perspectives. It's interesting to be in the policy space. I think when people hear I work on policy, they think politics, and that I spend a lot of my time working with government officials and wining and dining them and sort of negotiating with them. And that's certainly part of it, relationship building. But a lot of my work is actually more on sort of the regulatory side, really thinking through what does a policy design look like and how is that going to impact our products. So at Tesla, I work on the charging stuff again, but I also look at things like, how does permitting impact the speed at which we can deploy our charging infrastructure. So it's much more than just sort of these relationship building aspects of it. And that's the side that I've always found really interesting. And so for me, I've sort of had two different perspectives in that field leading towards the same end goal. So working for a trade association, you have to do a lot of consensus building. You have to be able to understand what your company's interests are, but you have to manage those interests and balance them against each other. So what might be good for one company might not work for another company, especially in the clean energy space. When you get down into regulatory stuff, like nitty gritty technical market design type stuff, you really have to understand and really know how that business operates. So a lot of my role in that space was the perspective of drive consensus, represent many different interests towards one goal, essentially. Versus at Tesla, I now represent one company's interests, but oftentimes the policies I work on could be for something that's for the greater good, or it could be something that just impacts our products. So I work on a lot of different stuff that might not be so appealing on its face, but there are things like building codes, right? My team is looking at new construction. Why are we looking at new construction buildings? Because the amount of money it costs to put EV ready infrastructure into building upfront is much, much less, 4 to 6 times less than if you have to go retrofit that building. And so if you look at the life cycle of the building for the next 20 to 30 to 50 years, you want to make sure you're preparing those buildings for electric vehicles now, because if you're not doing that, looking at the trajectory of electric vehicle sales and where we think the market will go, you're going to have to spend a lot more money later on to retrofit it. So we spend a lot of our time digging into really wonky building codes representing our company, but that also leads to greater good, right? We're helping a lot of other people by representing those interests. So for me, it's been really interesting to learn that policy, even though you can have different perspectives, you can drive towards the same good. And you can also sort of see yourselves as a salesperson. You have to kind of sell a policy internally to the product teams that you work with, but you also have to sell it externally to the people that you are trying to influence. So my point there is, policy in particular is an interesting field because a lot of people, again, think of it as this relationship building, but it's much more than that. I think it's very much related to a lot of the principles you learn taking econ courses here at UVA. So third point is impact. The theme again was sustainability in the private sector. So why do we care? And why does it matter that I am working towards a mission at a private company? Are we really having an impact? And I think for me, I like to think of sort of what real policy change can we drive, even though we're driving it in the interest of, for me, that's Tesla, for someone else, that might be another company. So I think the clean energy space, the transportation space, any of these topics that touch on sustainability are really exciting topics to be working on right now, because in all of these areas, we're at a point where, whether it's at the state level or at the local level or at the federal level, we're trying to fundamentally kind of change market designs and impact regulation and impact policies and drive innovation, with whether that's products or people or whatever it might be. And so, just looking at the electric vehicle space, 10 years ago, people thought we were crazy to start building a factory in California to manufacture electric vehicles in America. Back in 2008 to 2011, there were maybe 20,000 EVs on the road. We've well surpassed that number. And last year at Tesla, we manufactured almost 1 million vehicles. So it's really exciting that in a matter of, just a decade, we've come really, really far, and we still have a long ways to go. But I think the point there is you can have an impact even working for a private company in the sustainability space. Those things don't necessarily have to be in conflict with each other. You can marry them together and really create a lot of really interesting opportunities and influence, again, policy, markets, regulation, whatever it is that you are interested in working on. So I think, from my perspective, in order to really have a great career, you gotta get up every morning and enjoy what you do. That's great. You also have to kind of be able to really be good at what you're doing. And then the third part is you probably want to be compensated for that. And so if you could find something that can combine all those different things, you can really also have an impact in the world. And I think for me, as cheesy as it sounds, really working at Tesla, I do think I am having an impact in the world, even though it's just, maybe a tiny building code that I'm changing for the city of Denver or the state of California. All those small things add up, and I'm able to kind of think about the impact. We push hard at Tesla. It takes a lot of grit to work there, but it is something that, they're great people that work there, and I think we're all in it for the mission. And so that's why I enjoy being there. I've been there for 7 years. I don't think it's super typical these days to work at one company for that long. And I like the challenge that I get faced with every day. No day's the same. To recap again, drive, perspective, and then impact are sort of the 3 key things that I've learned in my career and that have really driven me to where I am today. So with that, thank you all for listening to me. Hopefully that was helpful, and I'm happy to open it up to any questions.
So I can start us off. I'm curious how you think ESG ratings, a lot of companies now are investing heavily in this. To what extent do you think this is a good indicator of how sustainable these companies are?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I will just say I'm not an expert in ESG ratings, and it's not sort of something I spend a ton of time thinking about. But I will say that any of those types of indicators, I think, have an impact. And I do think it's valuable to look at that. At Tesla, we don't necessarily prioritize that, but we do something called an impact report. So it's kind of our version of that to some extent. And we try to go through the environmental impact of all of our products, even though, we're zero emission, and that we only manufacture electric vehicles, and we have rooftop solar and storage products and large scale batteries, we still, all of those products have an input, right? And they come from somewhere. And so they have an impact in terms of their emissions. And so we started tracking that the last couple of years and actually reporting that, in this kind of impact report, and trying to hold ourselves accountable. We're a publicly traded company, so we're held accountable in many ways, but that was just another way to hold ourselves accountable to our standard of sort of having, getting to zero waste, all these other metrics that we could have. So again, I think it's an interesting one to look at. I'm not as familiar with it, but at Tesla, we do it slightly differently.
I have a question. What are some of the hard skills that have helped you become successful? Oh, by the way, my name's Reed and I'm a fourth year. But yeah, what are some of the hard skills that you've used or you use on your job like often that you think help you be successful?
Yeah, good question. So two that come to mind, and maybe more as I think about this real time, but I do a lot of writing, right? So regulation is a lot of analyzing, again, from a markets design or principles perspective, what would achieve whatever your end goal is. So if, again, that's like, whatever building code or whatever you're looking at, not thinking of a great example right now, but a lot of the hard skills that I've had to learn is sort of writing things down and articulating them in a very concise manner, but making good arguments. So it's funny because when I was at UVA, I don't know that I really enjoyed writing papers all the time, but a lot of my classes, whether that was, even in some of my econ courses, taught me how to take some of the kind of critical arguments, distill them, and be able to articulate them and then build off of that. So that's one really important skill. The other one is just knowing where to look for errors and poking holes into arguments. So I think econ probably helped more with that than foreign affairs, but sort of being able to, even if I'm not an expert in the topic, look at an argument and understand, oh, that doesn't make sense. Like you're not using sound data, you're not analyzing the numbers correctly. And then I rely on someone else much smarter than me to actually do the number crunching. But those are the types of skills that I have to use every day.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for taking your time doing this. My name is Tian Wei. I'm a second year econ major. So my question is that, what would you say is the biggest challenge you have faced in your 7 years at Tesla?
Biggest challenge. It's a great question also. And it's also a hard one to answer because I think there's sort of challenges in terms of what I work on. And then there's just inherent challenges of working for a publicly traded company. It has a lot of ups and downs. So in terms of what I work on, one of the biggest challenges is, I mentioned at the very beginning, I don't like working on policy for a really long time, years, but regulation takes at least 2 to 3 years in order to change. So I think that is tough to keep yourself motivated to continue to chip away at something that you may not change over 6 months, but you may change over 2 to 3 years. So, we work on electricity rate design, right? So we'll work with the Public Utilities Commission that regulates the utilities, and we'll look at the underlying electricity rate and try to make sure it matches how we're actually using electricity on the grid. It can get very wonky. But those types of things take years to figure out. It's not something you can just change overnight. So that's a challenge because you have to keep yourself motivated. The second one is just inherent in being part of a big company. I've had to go through a lot of layoffs and kind of ensure that the role I have is still needed at the company and still the right role. And I think each time you kind of go through something like that, you learn a lot about that. And where you're really just have fluff in terms of people who don't need to be there, not because they're not valuable in and of themselves, but because you don't need that particular skill set to sell your product, or where you have a gap. So, but that's challenging, right? You have to be willing to accept the risk that your job could change at any day or it couldn't be there anymore. But I also think it's rewarding and that you learn a lot that way and you really push yourself to the limit, which is kind of what I love about Tesla. You get pushed to sort of the limit of what you can achieve, or you might think you couldn't solve a problem, but you end up solving it. So those are kind of two areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ire, and it's really inspiring to hear that you are doing something that like can wake you up every day just by how much impact you can create. And I wonder, like looking back on your career development, it seems really smooth that you are like going from your original like trade associations to Tesla representing the private company's perspective, but like beneath the very smooth transition, are there any like zigzag? For example, within Tesla, did you like initially landed on a position that you didn't feel so passionate about or so good at? And then how did you find your niche within this company? And something related to this is that I know that Tesla is like a lot of jobs and positions in Tesla is still about engineering or business development, and something like what you are doing is not a very traditional job. So how do you envision students can do in a non-tech or non-business position in Tesla?
Yeah, so at the outset I mentioned I interned right after college, right? And so I had the opportunity to take that internship and not get a job full-time, partially because I couldn't get a job full-time and know what I wanted to do. And I was in a space where I was able to just take the internship instead. So I think early on in my career, it was a lot tougher to get to the place where I wanted to go. So I learned that I needed to put in the work. Entering the policy space is not an easy space to enter unless you happen to know someone on Capitol Hill and can easily kind of jump into that. And so I tried to figure out what internships could give me the experience to be able to build over time. And so I got really lucky in that those internships really did provide value, but it could have also turned out they weren't that great. And so I had to be able to kind of take that risk. So it hasn't been just super smooth. And I think it's very stressful to leave college and say, oh, I don't have a real job. But I did it and it turned out fine for me, right? So for 6 months to a year, I took that risk and I just really wanted to get the experience I had and kind of jumped around a little bit. And then ending up at Tesla, it's really interesting because I was part of an acquisition. So I actually had started at Solarcity, and then we were acquired shortly thereafter. And so my role originally was focused on California on a very particular rooftop solar issue. And once that issue was over, I was like, well, now what do I work on? So I took the opportunity when I transitioned to Tesla to start working on EV charging. But at the time in 2017, EV charging was not an important part of Tesla's business. So I took a big risk. But I thought it was a really interesting area. And again, I think I just got a little bit lucky that it ended up being something that we focus on now a lot. But within that, my role has shifted a lot. And I have had to do a lot of different things. And so, it used to be just me. And now I have a team and it's really grown. But over time, a lot of people, you just kind of have to pick up little pieces of things that you like doing. And oftentimes I do stuff that probably I'm not that passionate about, but I know that that's maybe a small percentage of what I'm working on.
Hi, I'm Maddie. I'm a third year econ major. And I was just wondering, what do you see as Tesla's future sustainability wise? What do you think they'll do next?
Oh, I've had a crystal ball. Tesla's interesting because I think during one of our last earnings calls, we talked about AI, and I know nothing about that part of the business and what that's doing. So There's sort of a whole different business line that I spend no time on. And that's very separate from my work. But I think at the end of the day, one of the big things that we're working on is not just serving today. The way the Tesla model works is on the charging side, we only serve our own customers, right? We only serve Tesla drivers. That's what it was built off of. It's why people bought our cars. And that's changing. We've announced a couple months ago that we're looking at providing charging services to other customers. So that's different for us, right? And something that's going to move us into a new space. At the same time, you know, we just opened our factory in Berlin, which I got to see last week, really cool. And we're expanding manufacturing. So, you know, there could be a future where we focus more on that side of things and we're not as focused on charging or the stuff that I work on, right? And we're faced by the same supply constraints like a lot of other companies with chip shortages and all this other stuff. So I'll be interested to see how we solve that problem, right? So yeah, it's always hard to tell, but I think one thing we've stayed constant on is our mission. So again, this idea of accelerating the world's transition to sustainable energy is something that's been in constant. The products have just evolved to meet that.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm Sri Lakshmi and I'm a first year. And my question for you is, you mentioned that like part of your role is like being a salesperson to external actors. So my question would be like, how do you convince these external actors that sustainability is a priority? Because I imagine that for them, it's like at the bottom line, they just want to like cut their costs down, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. A lot of times these days when I work externally, I'm working with like-minded companies. So a lot of it is working with other, for me, EV charging providers that are providing that as a service, no matter what their business model, lots of different business models out there. So we kind of share a similar end goal, but within that, we have different ways of getting there. And there are certainly things that would be a competitive advantage to one company that doesn't work for me. And vice versa. So I think one benefit I have is I've been in the same industry for over a decade. So a lot of the same people, even if they're orbit in the clean energy space. And so you build relationships with those people and they trust you. And so my mantra is always being really honest. So that has helped me. So when I come to someone and I say, hey, I think it'd be really good if you supported this, they know I'm being honest about the value to them potentially. So that's one way. The second way is trying to just find common ground. And I think I learned that for working for a trade association because you're always working for your members because you represent their interests. So I'm able to apply that now. But that's on the kind of company side. With other stakeholders, you know, I work with a lot of community groups, environmental organizations. So that's much more about like, what's their mission, what's their interest, and how do I make sure they don't see us as you know, disinterested or not wanting to help them meet their objectives. So a lot of kind of balancing interests and working together towards the same goal. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Spencer. I'm a third year. So I was curious, just related back to UVA, if you were kind of in our shoes right now, either looking at internships or jobs out of college, and you knew that sustainability was something that is important to you and something you want to work in, could you kind of speak to what sort of opportunities or experiences that we should be pursuing in order to acquire the experience and tools that we would probably need going forward as sustainability increases in importance in the private sector as well as just globally?
Yeah. So I mentioned I realized very late in my time at UVA that I really wanted to go into the sustainability space, and it wasn't as big of a topic then yet. I think now it's a much bigger topic for UVA as a whole. You all have a lot more resources than even I did at the time. But I think, seeking out opportunities outside of UVA itself. So what I mean by that is there are great Charlottesville organizations, companies that you can kind of plug yourself into. And I think COVID made that hard, right, for a while, because it was harder to kind of have those in-person connections. But I think even just taking someone who's working in this space on a virtual coffee chat, right, and learning about what they're doing can really kind of help you crystallize like, ooh, this is something I'd be interested in or not. So that part of it, I think, is always useful. In terms of kind of hard skills, I think you learn by doing. So whether that's finding an internship or even working on a project that has sustainability as a theme. A lot of my early work, even at UVA, was really just projects that touched on sustainability. You know, I mentioned my first internship, life cycle assessment. I had no idea how to do that, but I had a great mentor who kind of talked me through it. So, you know, use your professors who are amazing mentors, but also try to kind of get outside of the UVA community and see what you can access. And I think the benefit of COVID is that you can also access many places around the country virtually now, in the sense that you could get an internship or work on a project. So I think pros and cons there. I still prefer in person, but there's a lot more virtual opportunities. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you.
So you talked a little bit about you're working on sustainability with this very small company, Solarcity, and then now obviously a couple thousand employees. I'm wondering if that was a significant transition in terms of culture and whether you have preference.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think Tesla now has, if you count manufacturing, 70,000 employees or something absurd like that. So it's a really big company, but it feels really small still. I think part of that's because I've been there so long, but part of it's also that I get the opportunity to work with a lot of different people. So it actually doesn't feel that different from Solarcity. I think the challenges that we face are much larger, but it's not that different. What is different is having a manufacturing workforce, which is the majority of our company, separate from the business side of things, which is, you know, our little component of legal, product engineering, whatever our small part is. We're such a small component of this very large manufacturing based company, is really interesting and has kind of taught me a lot. I try to get out to the factory and go down to the assembly line and actually see it a lot, as often as possible, to make it feel real. And we didn't really have that part of it as much at Solarcity. We went out and saw rooftop solar installs, but that's a little bit different than going into the giant manufacturing plant and seeing robots and humans all working together to produce cars, which is pretty cool. So, you know, pros and cons to big versus small, but for what it's worth, Tesla doesn't feel that big, even though it is.
Hey, my name is Daniel. My question is, given kind of the issues we've seen with renewable energy as a dependent source for utility grids consistently, what do you think Tesla's plan should be to ensure kind of the availability of charging to its network at all times, kind of to avoid customers having that experience where maybe a wind source utility grid system is down? And do you think that includes maybe Tesla pursuing its own storage of energy or maybe even capture?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because we think about this actually right now, real time. And at Tesla, we have a large scale battery product called the Mega Pack, very supply constrained, as many of those types of batteries are. But we actually, where it makes economic sense today, we place solar and storage with our fast charging sites in order to ensure that if there's an outage, we still have consistent access. So in California, which obviously has the most number of EVs, it's a really big market for us. We're 70% of that electric vehicle market. We have 270 charging sites with like 4,000 chargers. It's huge. We have started to install a lot more batteries because California suffers from brownouts and blackouts and power shutoff events. So it's something that we're thinking about real time. So far, it hasn't been, you know, a hugely escalated issue, but you could also think about with, you know, more extreme weather events like hurricanes and tornadoes and other things. If people want to evacuate, like how are they going to rely on? Gas stations are also down if the power's out, but how are you going to rely on your car to be able to get out? And we have the benefit of, you know, we have software side of things too, where we can communicate with our customers. We can push notifications to them. So I think it's all to say we'll figure it out, but we got to work with the utility side of things too and see if they can do something on their end, right? That includes like putting large scale batteries at some of their key sites also to ensure that, you know, the grid doesn't just go down.
as a follow-up to that, how long do you think it'll take until, if ever, the energy dependency that we need for charging stations will eliminate fossil fuels? Do you think there's a timeline for that where it ever becomes entirely dependable?
I think it could. I like to be positively optimistic about that. What that timeline is a great question. And one interesting thing right now, and I didn't talk about it at all during my talk, but what I'm actually spending a lot of my time on right now is, you all may have heard, there was this large investment package that was signed by the federal government on infrastructure, not just charging, very small component, 7.5 billion, small component, but small component goes to EV charging. And as part of that, there's a lot of conversation of electrification of the grid in general, right? And so I think it's interesting to see what this influx of money will do to maybe even driving more innovation more quickly. Policy, I like to think, has obviously a big role in that. And so we're seeing a lot of actually local governments trying to push towards some of these goals more quickly. So the way utilities are structured in the US, you have regulated utilities, you have municipally owned utilities. So local governments, like a city, can own your utilities. And so sometimes we see more innovation and opportunity to push the envelope faster at the local level. So I'm decently optimistic that we're going to see, I think we will get there, but I don't know when.
I have another question. What are some of the stages that go into, or processes that go into determining where to put your next charging station, or whether that's a viable location?
Yeah, so we evaluate a number of different factors. We look at, one of the key things we look at is, obviously, since we have the vehicle side of things too, we can see where we see growth, growth on the network, but just growth in general of EV penetration, where we see congestion on our existing sites. And then we look at things like amenities, big deal for us. We want to make sure customers, if they get out of their car to charge, which they likely will, have access to, a cup of coffee or a restroom, or, feel safe in that environment. So we look at that. And then we also look at the economics of that site. Like, does that make sense? Tesla owns and operates our own stations, but we have agreements with landlords. So like, we partner with Wawa and other people to locate our chargers there. So it's, yeah, sometimes we have to look for where there's actually sites available that we can access. So lots of different factors, but those are kind of some of the key ones.
Okay. And as a follow-up to that, do you guys see like yourself pushing a certain sort of, like, let's say you go on across the country drive on an electric vehicle, are you guys going to like install certain things where it's like sort of like a gas station, or where, like you mentioned, amenities, where you're having a charging station and then you'll have like a whole Tesla charging station where people can go charge their car for like 40 minutes and then go there? Or is it more of like individual locations? You guys aren't really like, I don't know how to explain that, but if you sort of understand.
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at. So today, luckily, you can pretty much go anywhere in the US on the Tesla network. It might take you a little bit of time, but you could do it. And in the car, I'll tell you where to charge along your trip. For all of those stations, we always locate them with amenities. We do have examples of where we, station in Kettleman City, California, it's 80 fast chargers at a site. It's giant. It's not normally how we build, but we see so much traffic there between San Francisco and LA. So we built the site and we built our own coffee shop. So we have a lounge and a coffee shop, and that's open. It's not open all day, all the time, but it's open to our customers. And then you've got like, all kinds of Five Guys and all kinds of other stuff around. But that could be another future model, but that's sort of how we think about it.
Okay, thank you.
I think there was a question in the back.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, with your employment commencing through an acquisition that wasn't even really part of Tesla's core business, and policy being even a little bit further removed from the center of attention, whether there was any uncertainty about what your new role would be at Tesla, whether you would stay at all. And you mentioned being on a team of one at the very beginning. Just talking about a little bit about what it's like to trailblaze like that within an organization.
Yeah. So lots of uncertainty. I like to think I'm so great they had to keep me, but I don't think that's actually the case. I very quickly learned to prioritize what I thought would bring value to the company, and make sure that other stakeholders understood that as well. So early on in the days of being acquired, there was a lot of education just on like, how does policy impact this product? And charging was core to our business in the sense that in order to sell cars, we needed charging. So I had to sort of directly relate all of my policy stuff to, well, if you want to sell more cars, which is one of the core objectives you have, we need to work on this. But in terms of being a team of one, I was part of a larger policy team. I was just the only person working on charging really, along with my boss, who was working on that and 50 other issues, still is today. And I think one of the benefits we had is we had great leadership at the top that was able to advocate with our executives about the value of what we bring to the table. So I think you have to have buy-in somewhere at the leadership level that can translate back to the executives that says, hey, here's why policy is important. Here's how it can impact the bottom line. Here's why these people need to be doing it. And then we had pretty tough goals to achieve, right? And if we didn't meet those, we wouldn't be there anymore. So I think that was pretty clear at the outset. So I think my mantra was get it done, know the product team really well, know what they need, and understand the business.
So I think if there's no more questions, maybe
There's one
oh,
more question.
yeah, go for it.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a third year, and I was just wondering. Well, you talked about how the sustainability sphere has expanded in the past few years, but I was wondering if you found that just in general, if there are more career opportunities that merge economics and sustainability in California than in other major cities, particularly on the East Coast.
There used to be, but I think that's changed. And I think that's because there's a lot more emphasis now on the East Coast also on, again, funding is part of it for programs, right? To drive products. Like there's a lot of funding that's come in. But I think just in general, what we saw for a couple of years is that at the local level, there was a lot of leadership in terms of setting really tough policies to drive again, anything in the sustainability space, but GHG emissions reductions, all kinds of stuff. And so I think, whereas California as a state has always focused on that, New York, even I think in certain parts of Virginia, there's stuff that's happening. Charlottesville is a leader in many ways on that. But there's a lot more focus now, I think, within at the local level. And so that's kind of elevated some of these places where before you didn't see as much action. And so like on our policy team right now, we're hiring for a role to do Northeast energy policy because we see a huge need for it, right? And maybe 2-3 years ago we didn't. So it's been really fun to kind of watch it shift. But it also was great to go to California. It's its own bizarre world to work in policy in California. But I cover now North America, so I get to see a lot of the kind of shifting mindset.
Okay, if there's no more questions.
Sorry, can I ask?
Go for it.
So you mentioned that you were working on to make policy prepare for EV ready building for the next 20 to 30 years. I'm just interested in how much changes has happened in this very new field and what other intersectionality do you see between transportation and construction?
Yeah, we are seeing a lot more, and I'll keep it brief because I know we're close to the end of time, but we're seeing a lot more developers, big apartment developers or big kind of shopping complex developers actually saying to us, hey, we want to put in charging proactively, even without a policy being in place. And I would say 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. So that's been really exciting to see is that they see it as an amenity that they need to have in order to have an attractive building that someone wants to own. So you're starting to see a lot more of these policies start to mix together. I mean, there's always been, ratings for LEED and all these other things for green buildings. But I think you're actually starting to see the impact of that now outside of requirements, just pure for business reasons, people are doing it.
Send us off.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Francesca.